The morning after my father was buried, my husband walked into the boardroom wearing my grief like a tailored suit. By noon, they were calling him Mr. CEO. By evening, he was sitting at the head of the table that used to belong to my father, and I was sitting 3 seats away, like a guest in my own bloodline. I didn't cry when the will was read. I didn't even flinch when they said his name instead of mine. But when I saw the date on the signature 3 months before my father died, something inside my chest split open. That was around the time Dad stopped returning my calls and started having private meetings with my husband. That night, I stood outside our bedroom door and heard him whisper into the phone, "She doesn't need to know yet." I thought losing my father was the worst pain I would ever survive. I was wrong. Because before the week was over, I would realize I hadn't just been left out of the inheritance. I had been written out of my own marriage, and I still don't know which betrayal came first. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. The morning after my father was buried, I sat in the same leather chair I used to curl into as a teenager, waiting for the will to be read like it was just another board meeting. The air in the conference room smelled like coffee and polished wood. My husband sat beside me, his hand resting lightly on my knee, steady and warm. I remember thinking I was lucky. I had lost my father, but at least I hadn't lost him. The attorney unfolded the document slowly, paper against paper. No one coughed, no one moved. When my father's company was mentioned, the company he built from a rented warehouse and 2 folding desks, my chest tightened. I had grown up inside that building. I learned to read on invoices. I learned to count by stacking shipping receipts. Every summer of my childhood smelled like printer ink and ambition. Then the name was spoken. My husband's, not mine. I didn't gasp. I didn't argue. I felt something colder than anger slide under my skin. Around the table, eyes shifted toward me, then away again. Pity is louder than sympathy. It hums in the walls, the attorney continued, explaining structure, voting rights, transition of leadership. Words like confidence, continuity, strategic stability. My husband squeezed my knee once, as if to reassure me. I couldn't feel his hand anymore. When the document was passed around, I forced myself to look at it. My father's signature sat at the bottom of the page, sharp and deliberate. I checked the date, 3 months before he died. 3 months before he stopped answering my calls and began canceling our weekly lunches. 3 months before he told me, over a short and unusually formal dinner, that I needed to trust the process. I thought he meant grief, or retirement. I didn't realize he meant this. After the meeting, the board members shook my husband's hand. "Congratulations. We're behind you. Your father-in-law would be proud." The word proud scraped against my ribs. I watched him stand at the head of the table, my father's seat, listening as they discussed transition plans. He didn't hesitate before sitting down. Not even a pause, not even a glance at me. That was the first moment I felt it. Not betrayal, replacement. By late afternoon, an internal email had been sent out announcing him as CEO, effective immediately. My phone buzzed with messages from employees I had known since childhood. Some said they were surprised. Others said they assumed this had always been the plan. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Always the plan. At home that evening, the house felt unfamiliar. The framed photos in the hallway, our wedding, our son's first day of school, my father holding him as a newborn, looked staged, like evidence arranged for a trial. My husband loosened his tie in the kitchen and poured himself a drink. He looked tired, but not shaken, not hollowed out the way I felt. "This is what your father wanted," he said quietly. I searched his face for something: guilt, doubt, discomfort. I found none. "When did he decide that?" I asked. He took a sip before answering. "It's been in discussion for a while." A while. 3 months. The number throbbed in my head. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside him, listening to his breathing settle into a steady rhythm. I wondered how long he had known. I wondered how many dinners I had cooked while decisions about my future were being made across polished tables without me. Around midnight, I got up for water and noticed the light under his office door was on. His voice was low, measured. "She doesn't need to know yet." I froze in the hallway. There was a pause on the other end of the line. He turned slightly, and I stepped back into the shadow before he could see me. "I'll handle it," he added. "Handle what?" I stood there long after the call ended, staring at the thin strip of light beneath the door. I had spent years believing marriage meant partnership, shared burdens, shared victories, shared losses. But as I listened to the quiet house, my father gone, his chair occupied, his company transferred, I understood something I hadn't let myself see in that boardroom. The inheritance wasn't the only thing that had changed hands, and I had the sudden, unbearable feeling that whatever I didn't need to know yet was already too late. That night he worked in his office before dinner was even cleared from the table. Our son asked if his father was going to watch the game footage with him, and I heard myself answer, "He's busy," like I had rehearsed it. Around 10, my phone buzzed with an automated notification from the company server. "Your access credentials have been modified." I stared at the message, waiting for a second alert that would correct it, but nothing came. I opened the executive portal and entered my password. Access denied. I tried again more slowly, as if precision might restore authority. Access denied. The words looked sterile, almost polite, but my pulse began to thud against my ribs. I walked down the hallway and pushed his office door open without knocking. He was sitting at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled once at the forearm, the glow of the laptop lighting half his face. Legal documents filled the screen. I saw my name in a bold header before he adjusted the angle. Just slightly, just enough. "You changed my access," I said. He didn't look startled. He didn't look guilty. "IT is restructuring permissions," he replied, fingers still resting on the keyboard. "It's temporary." Temporary. The same word companies use before something disappears for good. I stepped closer, close enough to see the reflection of myself in the dark edge of his screen. "I'm on the executive board." He exhaled slowly, like I was being unreasonable. "You still are. Still. Present tense. Fragile." "Then why can't I see the financial reports?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair, studying me in a way that felt less like a husband and more like an assessment. "Because right now," he said evenly, "it's better if I handle certain transitions alone." Handle. Alone. The space between us felt wider than the hallway behind me. I realized then that this wasn't about grief or timing or protecting me from stress. Systems had to be updated. Permissions had to be approved. Someone had to authorize the change. And the only person with that authority now was him. I stood there waiting for him to soften, to add something that sounded like partnership, but he simply turned the laptop back toward himself and resumed typing. The quiet clicking of the keys filled the room. Each stroke sounded deliberate, final. After a moment, he said, without looking up, "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will be busy." Busy. I watched the side of his face, searching for the man who used to ask my opinion before making even small decisions, the man who once told me we were strongest when we moved together. The screen reflected numbers and clauses I was no longer allowed to read. I understood something then that no notification could phrase politely. My access hadn't just been modified, it had been revoked. And the most unsettling part wasn't that he had the power to do it. It was that he had already decided I shouldn't have it. I didn't sleep. The rhythm of his typing kept replaying in my head, steady and controlled, like someone drafting a future I hadn't agreed to. By morning, I understood one thing clearly: confronting him without leverage would only make me smaller in the room. If he was already moving pieces quietly, I needed to see which ones had disappeared. When I stepped into the office, the energy had shifted again. Conversations softened when I passed, not silent, just recalibrated. I caught words floating in the air. Efficiency, transition, streamlining. Corporate language has a way of sounding clean while it bleeds people out behind closed doors. At 10:30, a company-wide email arrived. Leadership realignment, Phase 1. I opened it at my desk without blinking. The first paragraph praised long-term dedication. The second referenced market adaptation. By the third, names began to appear under a section titled Immediate Executive Changes. Halfway down the page, I saw his, Daniel Harper, my father's right hand for 25 years. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to his office. The door was open. A cardboard box rested on the credenza. Framed photographs were already turned face down beside it, as if they were embarrassed to witness what was happening. "They gave me 30 minutes, Daniel said quietly before I could speak. "For what?" I asked, though I already knew. "To make it easier on everyone." "Easier." I stepped inside. "I'll talk to him." Daniel gave me a look that wasn't hopeful, it was careful. He signed the termination at 9:02 this morning. 9:02. Precise. Deliberate. My father used to say Daniel was the only man in the company who would argue with him and still show up early the next day. He trusted him with numbers, negotiations, even with me when I first joined the board. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "You know every contract, every client." Daniel closed the lid of the box gently. "Your father was afraid," he said. The word hit harder this time. "Afraid of what?" I asked. He hesitated, glancing toward the hallway. "He wasn't afraid of the market," Daniel said finally. "He was afraid of losing control to someone who moved faster than he did." Someone. I didn't need him to say the name. Footsteps approached. My husband appeared at the doorway, sleeves rolled once at the forearm, expression steady. "This isn't personal," he said. Daniel gave a small nod. "It never is." My husband stepped into the office, hands resting loosely in his pockets. "We can't run this company on loyalty alone." "He gave this company his life," I said. "And I intend to keep it alive," he replied evenly. The difference between those two sentences felt like a fracture line. Daniel lifted the box. For a second, I thought he might say something reckless, something that would crack the room open. Instead, he turned to me. "Your father didn't trust speed without oversight," he said quietly. "Be careful who controls both." Then he walked past my husband without another word. The hallway seemed longer as he disappeared down it, carrying decades in a cardboard box. I turned to my husband. "You removed the one person who would question you." He held my gaze. "I removed resistance." "Resistance to what?" To stagnation." The answer was too smooth, too ready. I looked at Daniel's empty desk, at the clean surface where history had just been wiped away. My father used to sit in this office late at night with Daniel, arguing over margins and expansion risks. Now the only voice left making decisions was the one that had quietly taken control of my access the night before. My phone buzzed in my hand. Not a system alert this time. An updated board roster attachment from the corporate secretary. I opened it. My name was still there, but no longer under voting executive members. It had been moved to advisory. Advisory. I read the word twice to be sure it hadn't shifted on its own. Across the hall, my husband was already speaking with the CFO about restructuring timelines. Confident, certain, uninterrupted. Daniel hadn't been removed because he was outdated. He had been removed because he remembered how power used to be shared. And as I stood there, staring at a title that no longer meant authority, I realized something far more unsettling than a demotion. I wasn't being pushed out loudly. I was being repositioned quietly. And in companies like ours, the people who get repositioned rarely stay long enough to see phase 2. Advisory. I kept staring at the word long after the attachment closed, as if the title might rearrange itself out of shame. Advisory meant I could be present, nod at the right moments, offer an opinion that could be thanked and ignored. It meant the company my father built had found a way to keep my face in the hallway while removing my hands from the wheel. By noon, I realized waiting for my husband to talk when things settle was exactly how people get erased quietly, politely, with forms and calendar invites. If my father had been afraid of speed without oversight, then the only way to understand what was happening was to trace the one place my father still controlled, even from the grave: paper. The attorney who managed his estate was 20 minutes away, tucked above a row of storefronts that never seemed to change. The brass plaque on the door still read the same firm name, and beneath it, in smaller letters, my father's name followed by client since 1998, like a badge of loyalty bolted into metal. Inside, the receptionist looked up with the careful neutrality people wear around grief. "He's in a meeting," she said. "I'll wait," I replied, and I chose the corner chair I remembered from childhood, the one where my feet used to swing above the carpet while my father negotiated mergers behind closed doors. The walls were lined with framed degrees, photographs of ribbon cuttings, and a grainy newspaper clipping of my father shaking hands with a senator, his posture confident, his smile controlled. I tried to remember when that confidence had shifted into something quieter, more guarded. The conference room door opened, and the attorney stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks. When he saw me, he paused just a fraction of a second too long, and that pause told me I was not part of his day's plan. "I didn't expect you," he said. "I didn't expect a lot of things this week," I answered, and the calm in my voice surprised even me. He dismissed his assistant with a glance and ushered me into his office, closing the door softly as if softness could keep secrets intact. I didn't sit at first. "When did my father change the will?" I asked. He moved behind his desk, hands hovering over a folder as though the folder could bite. "You saw the date," he said. "I want to know why." He folded his hands, the way men do when they're about to offer you a version of the truth that costs them the least. "Your father believed the company required continuity," he began. "That's not an answer," I said. "It's the one he gave me," he replied, and for a moment I wondered if he had practiced that sentence. I sat, leaning forward. Was my husband involved? A tightness appeared along his jaw. "Your husband was present for several discussions," he admitted. "Several?" "Yes." The air in the office felt suddenly heavier, like the building had shifted on its foundation. "Was I ever present for those discussions?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the folder and adjusted a document inside it without letting me see the page. The movement was small, protective, almost instinctive. "Your father was concerned," he said carefully, "about instability if something happened unexpectedly." "Instability in the market?" I pressed. He met my eyes. "Instability in leadership." The word landed like a stamp. "You mean me," I said. "I mean," he corrected gently. "He questioned whether you were prepared to assume sole control under pressure." My throat tightened. "He never said that to me. He didn't want to undermine you," the attorney replied, and the irony nearly split my chest. "And handing everything to my husband wasn't undermining?" He exhaled slowly. "Your father believed your husband would protect both you and the company." Protect. The word had been circling me for days like a hawk. "Protect me from what?" I asked, quieter now. He held my gaze longer than before. "From decisions driven by emotion," he said, clinical and calm, and I felt my fingers curl around the armrest, as if I needed something solid to keep from sliding. "Is there anything else?" I asked. "Anything I should know?" A hesitation. He closed the folder halfway, then stopped, as if he'd remembered something too late. I caught a glimpse of a heading before the paper disappeared, Post-Nuptial Addendum. My pulse jumped. "What is that?" I asked. His hand flattened over the folder. "Additional structural considerations," he said. "What kind of considerations?" "Contingencies," he answered. "For conflict," the word echoed. "Conflict between who?" I asked, and he reached for his water glass, buying himself another second of control. "Your father wanted safeguards," he said carefully, "in case personal matters interfered with corporate stability." "Personal matters," I repeated, tasting the phrase. "Are you talking about my marriage?" He didn't deny it. Silence is a kind of confirmation when it's this deliberate. I stood to leave, legs steady in a way my heart wasn't. At the door, I turned back. Did my father ever say he didn't trust my husband? The attorney's expression shifted, measured, cautious. He said trust, he replied, should never exist without verification. Outside, the air felt sharper, thinner. My father hadn't just rearranged an inheritance, he'd built a trapdoor. A post-nuptial addendum, contingencies for conflict, safeguards for personal matters. And as I walked to my car, one thought hardened into certainty. My father didn't hand my husband the company because he believed in him. He handed him the rope and waited to see what kind of man would pull it tight. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from, and what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. My father hadn't handed my husband the company out of blind faith. If there was a post-nuptial addendum hidden in that folder, then what I was looking at wasn't succession planning, it was design. And design always leaves a financial trace. I sat in my car outside the attorney's office, staring at the steering wheel, replaying the word post-nuptial in my mind. Years ago, we had signed a prenuptial agreement without drama. My father had insisted. My husband had agreed easily, even smiled when he signed. "It's just paper," he'd said, squeezing my hand across the table. Paper had never been just paper in my father's world. Instead of driving home, I turned toward the downtown branch of our company, the quieter building where the accounting systems were older and the people had known me long before titles started shifting. The elevator ride felt suspended, like the pause before a verdict. When the doors opened, a few employees glanced up, their expressions polite but careful. Change had already started teaching them how to behave around me. Maria's office was at the end of the corridor. She stood when she saw me, surprise flickering across her face. "I didn't know you were coming in," she said. "Neither did I answered. She closed the door behind me, and I remained standing. "I need to review equity transfers from the past 2 years, anything tied to executive restructuring." Her eyes dropped briefly to her screen. "Your access was modified." "I know. Pull it under yours." She hesitated, the weight of policy settling between us. "There will be an audit trail," she said quietly. "I understand." After a moment, she turned to the keyboard. Files appeared, routine reallocations, internal adjustments clean and predictable. Then she opened a folder labeled Special Purpose Holdings. "These were approved through direct executive authorization," she said carefully. The signature block at the bottom read my husband's name. The date read 2 years ago. "What is Special Purpose Holdings?" I asked. "A temporary acquisition vehicle," Maria replied, "used to accumulate minority shares discreetly." She scrolled further. The percentage wasn't large enough to seize control outright, but it was enough to shift leverage in a divided vote. "Where did the capital originate?" I asked. She opened the transaction history. A sequence of wire transfers from an entity called Everett Capital Partners. The name meant nothing to me. Ownership structure? Private fund. Limited disclosure. Registration date? Another click. 2 years and 3 months ago. 3 months before my father changed the will. The precision of that timing pressed against my ribs. "Was my father aware of this fund?" I asked. Maria chose her words like stepping stones. Equity movement at that level requires executive awareness. Awareness, not necessarily approval. "Was there pushback?" I asked. Her eyes shifted toward the door. "There were discussions. With Daniel?" A small nod. So Daniel hadn't been removed because he was sentimental. He had been removed because he had resisted early. I stepped back from the desk, the architecture of it coming into view. My husband hadn't become powerful overnight. He had been assembling power quietly, incrementally, before illness and funerals clouded anything. "Could this fund intersect with family assets?" I asked. Maria's pause answered before she did. "I don't have visibility into guarantor structures," she said. I thanked her and left before the air in the room thickened further. In the elevator, I searched the state business registry on my phone. Everett Capital Partners appeared instantly. Managing Director, my husband. Registered, 2 years and 3 months ago. I scrolled through the filing details until a line stopped me cold. Primary guarantor. Estate of the elevator doors slid open before I could finish reading. I stepped into the lobby, the hum of the building carrying on as if nothing fundamental had shifted. If the estate had guaranteed the fund that purchased my husband's shares, then my father hadn't been blindsided. He had participated. The rope hadn't simply found its way into my husband's hands. Someone had funded it. And I was beginning to understand that the inheritance wasn't a gift, it was leverage waiting to tighten. The rope hadn't simply been placed in my husband's hands. Someone had financed it. I remained in the lobby for a moment after the elevator doors opened, staring at the unfinished line on my phone until the screen dimmed. I didn't need to see the rest of the estate filing to understand what it implied. My father had guaranteed the vehicle that accumulated my husband's leverage. That wasn't surrender. That was structure. I drove home without turning on the radio, letting the silence press against the realization forming in my chest. If my father had underwritten the acquisition, then the will wasn't an act of trust. It was a conditional transfer, and conditions leave documentation. The house was quiet when I stepped inside. My husband's car wasn't in the driveway yet. Our son's backpack lay open on the kitchen counter, math homework half finished, a pencil rolling slowly toward the edge. Ordinary life. I stood there longer than necessary, steadying myself before walking upstairs to the study we had never repainted after moving in the one room that still carried my father's scent in the wood grain and dust. I unlocked the bottom drawer of the desk with the spare key I'd kept out of habit. I had gone through these files before, months ago, after the funeral. Back then I was looking for comfort, not clauses. This time I was looking for triggers, trust documents, tax summaries, handwritten notes in my father's disciplined script. I moved carefully, slower than I felt. Halfway through the stack, I noticed an envelope I didn't remember opening. My name was written in block letters, not affectionately, but deliberately. The date in the corner matched the week Everett Capital Partners had been registered. I sat before breaking the seal. If you are reading this, the transition has already begun. There was no greeting, no softness, just direction. I continued. I have structured the company to require alignment between leadership and long-term governance. Authority without oversight creates risk. If alignment fails, corrective mechanisms activate automatically. The language was clinical, almost cold. Further down the page, I found references to conditional voting thresholds, fiduciary compliance standards, and reversionary control tied to marital dissolution or breach of governance duty. The inheritance wasn't permanent. It was performance-based. My father had financed the acquisition vehicle, yes, but he had also embedded clauses into the bylaws that could shift control into a trust if certain behavioral lines were crossed. He hadn't chosen my husband over me. He had chosen a stress test. Footsteps echoed downstairs. The front door opened. My husband's voice carried faintly through the hallway as he greeted our son. I slid the letter back into the envelope and returned it to the drawer, my pulse steadying into something colder than hurt. When he appeared in the doorway of the study, he paused at the sight of me sitting behind the desk. "I didn't know you were home," he said. "I finished early," I replied. His eyes drifted briefly to the drawer before returning to my face. "You've been busy," I said. "So have you." A polite exchange, almost friendly. "Did you know about Everett Capital before the will changed?" I asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. The honesty was calculated. "And the estate guarantee?" "Your father approved the structure," he replied. "He believed in managed transitions." "Managed." "He believed in oversight," I said quietly, a faint tightening at the corner of his jaw there, and gone. "He believed stability required discipline," my husband answered. "Emotional leadership destabilizes value." There it was again. Emotion, reduced to liability. "And if alignment fails?" I asked. He stepped further into the room, meeting my eyes evenly. "Then consequences follow," he said. Not a threat, not a warning. Just certainty. He believed he was aligned. He believed he was compliant. He believed the structure existed to secure him. As he turned and walked away, I remained seated in my father's chair, feeling the weight of the system beneath the silence. The company didn't belong to me. It didn't belong to him. It belonged to conditions neither of us could fully see. And for the first time since the will was read, I understood something he didn't. The inheritance wasn't testing my loyalty. It was testing his. The inheritance wasn't testing my loyalty. It was testing his. By the time morning came, that thought had settled into something steadier than anger. If he believed he had already mastered the system my father built, then the only way to understand him was to watch how he behaved when challenged directly. I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The executive floor was quiet, sunlight stretching across the glass walls like nothing inside them had shifted. His office door was open. He was already there, sleeves rolled once at the forearm, reviewing something on his screen with that same measured calm he wore like a tailored jacket. He looked up when he saw me. "You're early," he said. "So are you." I stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "I reviewed the governance documents," I said evenly. "There are conditional clauses tied to leadership conduct." He leaned back slightly, studying me. "Your father believed in contingency planning." "He believed in oversight," I replied. A faint pause, not surprise. Calculation. "Did he explain the triggers to you?" I asked. "Yes," no hesitation. "And you're certain you won't activate them?" He held my gaze. "I understand the thresholds." The distinction was deliberate. I moved closer to his desk. "You began accumulating shares through Everett Capital 2 years ago." "Correct. With estate backing. With your father's approval." "Without telling me." His jaw tightened, subtle but visible. "Strategic positioning doesn't require emotional consensus," he said. Emotional. The word again, placed carefully between us like evidence. Did he ever tell you he doubted me? I asked. This time he didn't answer immediately. He stood, slowly, not to intimidate but because he had run out of room behind the desk. He questioned whether you were ready to carry the weight alone, he said. Alone, I repeated. Or without you. His eyes flickered, just for a second, toward the window before returning to mine. He believed the company needed steadiness, he replied, and you define that as yourself. I define it as discipline. You define it as control, I said quietly. The air shifted. Not loud, not explosive, just tighter. You think I manipulated him, he said. I think you prepared for his death before it happened. The words didn't rise. They landed. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. I prepared for transition, he corrected, because someone had to, and that someone was never going to be me, I said. He stepped closer, stopping just short of where intimacy would have been. You see hostility where there's structure, he said. I see exclusion where there's transparency missing, I answered. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city beyond the glass moved without us. You read the letter, he said finally. It wasn't a question. Yes. Then you know this isn't arbitrary. I know it isn't unconditional. Something in his expression hardened, not defensive, definitive. I haven't breached anything, he said. Not legally. The qualifier slipped out before he could catch it, a small crack in a polished surface. I held his gaze. Alignment isn't proven by compliance, I said softly. It's proven by intent. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he straightened his cuff as if resetting himself. If you believe there's a test, he said, voice even again, then observe. An invitation, or a warning. I turned toward the door, my pulse steady but colder than it had been the week before. He believed he understood every clause, every threshold, every consequence written into my father's system. He believed discipline would shield him from exposure. But discipline doesn't erase motive. And as I stepped back into the hallway, I realized something that felt sharper than anger. I didn't need to remove him from power. I only needed him to keep acting exactly the way he already was. I didn't need to remove him from power. I only needed him to keep acting exactly the way he already was. By the end of the week, that opportunity arrived, disguised as efficiency. A memo went out late Thursday announcing a consolidation of 2 divisions under his direct supervision. The language was polished, cost reduction, streamlined reporting, improved coordination, but halfway through the document I noticed something that made my pulse slow instead of spike. During periods of transitional instability, interim oversight of certain trust-linked voting shares would temporarily fall under the CEO's authority. Transitional instability. The phrase was vague enough to stretch and precise enough to justify. Those shares were tied to the conditional trust my father embedded in the bylaws. They weren't meant to sit under executive discretion. They were meant to sit above it. I walked into the conference room before the executive session began. He was alone at the table, reviewing briefing notes, his father-in-law's chair fitting him too naturally now. He didn't look surprised when he saw me. "You've read it," he said. "Yes." I closed the door behind me. "You're not consolidating divisions. You're consolidating oversight." He leaned back, calm as ever. "I'm preventing fragmentation. You're narrowing the window before anyone can question the timing," I replied, a faint tightening at the corner of his mouth. "The market doesn't wait for internal hesitation," he said. "Leadership requires decisiveness." "Decisiveness isn't the same as control," I answered. He stood slowly, walking toward the window. "If volatility hits and those shares are locked in debate, we lose momentum," he said. "This protects the company." "Or protects you," I said quietly. The room didn't explode. It constricted. "You think I'm manipulating the system," he said. "I think you're adjusting it before it can evaluate you." He turned then, meeting my eyes more sharply than before. "Your father trusted me to carry this forward." "He trusted conditions," I corrected. For the first time, he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a folder near his elbow. I noticed the stack beneath it proxy assignments. Several minority board members had delegated their votes due to scheduling conflicts. 48 hours notice on a restructuring vote. Efficient, convenient. "You scheduled this quickly," I said. "There wasn't time for extended debate. There wasn't time for independent review," I replied. He exhaled, a controlled release. You're turning operational necessity into accusation. You're turning urgency into insulation. That landed. Not loudly, but cleanly. He stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. If you have an objection, bring it to the board. I will, I said. But I'm also documenting the pattern. His eyes flickered, not fear, not yet but awareness. This isn't personal, he said. I almost smiled at that. It stopped being personal when you stopped including me, I replied. The truth of it hung between us heavier than any governance clause. We weren't arguing about divisions anymore. We were arguing about visibility, about who was allowed to see the whole picture and who was expected to trust the edited version. You believe I'm positioning myself, he said. You already did, I answered. For a moment, I saw something beneath the control fatigue. Maybe, or annoyance that I was no longer reacting emotionally. He had expected anger. He was getting scrutiny. The vote will pass, he said finally. Probably, I agreed. That's not the point. Then what is? He asked. I looked at the proxy forms one more time before stepping back toward the door. Patterns don't break companies overnight, I said softly. They reveal them. He didn't reply. And as I left the room, I understood something that settled deeper than strategy. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't desperate. He was confident that every move he made could be explained, defended, justified, confident that no one was watching the sequence closely enough to see the shape forming underneath it. And confidence, I was beginning to realize, leaves fingerprints everywhere. Confidence leaves fingerprints everywhere. I began noticing them not only in boardrooms and proxy forms, but in the quiet corners of my own house. The following Sunday, while he reviewed financial forecasts at the kitchen island, our son sat across from him working on a history project about constitutional checks and balances. I stood at the sink, water running over dishes that were already clean, listening as our son read aloud, "Power should never go unchecked." My husband nodded without lifting his eyes from the spreadsheet. That's why systems exist, he said. Systems. Even here, even with our child between us. Later that afternoon, I went into his office looking for a warranty document. I wasn't searching for anything else. But when I opened the lower drawer of his cabinet, I saw a leather-bound folder I didn't recognize. It wasn't hidden. It was positioned neatly, as if it belonged there. Inside were trust documents bearing our son's full legal name. I sat down slowly in his chair and began to read. The shares accumulated through Everett Capital had been transferred into a newly structured trust. Trustee, my husband. Beneficiary, our son. Protective clause. In the event of marital dissolution, Financial Distribution Authority remains under acting trustee discretion until beneficiary reaches age 25. I read the language twice, then a third time. College tuition, living expenses, healthcare allocations, all tied to the trust, all routed through him. If I filed for divorce, the income stream attached to those shares would not shift to joint management. It would remain under his control, justified under fiduciary protection for the beneficiary. It was clean, thorough, designed not to crack under scrutiny. When he entered the doorway, he stopped. His eyes moved from me to the folder and back again. He didn't rush. He didn't reach for it. You were going to tell me? I asked. Yes, when? When everything was finalized. It looks finalized. He stepped further into the room. It protects him. It protects you, I said quietly. It protects stability, he corrected. The word had changed, but the meaning hadn't. You moved the shares after consolidating them, I continued. Yes, and appointed yourself trustee. Yes, and if I leave you? His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. The trust remains intact, and you retain discretion over the funds tied to our son. I retain fiduciary responsibility. Responsibility. The vocabulary was always immaculate. I stood, holding the folder between us. You structured it so any decision I make about our marriage directly affects his financial security, I said. That's not why it was done. Then why? He exhaled slowly. Because your father believed family assets should remain insulated from personal instability. Instability. You mean conflict, I said. I mean protection, he replied. I studied his face, searching for hesitation. I found none, only certainty. The same certainty he wore in board meetings now wrapped itself around our child's future. "Did my father know you intended to place the shares in a trust under your sole control?" I asked. "Yes." The answer came too cleanly. "And he approved?" "He understood the reasoning." "The reasoning." I closed the folder carefully and slid it back into the drawer. The movement felt slower than it was. "You built a firewall," I said. "Around the company, around the trust, around him." "I built security," he answered, "for all of us." But the truth sat heavier than his wording. If I challenged him publicly, the board vote would pass. If I challenged him privately, the trust remained intact. If I walked away, the financial gate to our son's inheritance stayed in his hands. He wasn't threatening custody. He didn't need to. He was betting on something far simpler. I looked at him steadily. "You're very confident," I said. "I'm careful," he replied. I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "You're confident I won't risk hurting him just to prove you wrong." Something shifted in his eyes, then not fear, not anger, but calculation adjusting to resistance. "You wouldn't," he said. It wasn't a question. I held his gaze and felt the weight of the house around us, our son's footsteps down the hall, the silence my father had engineered into paper and clauses and trust language. "You're right," I said softly. And in that moment, I understood the real leverage in this marriage wasn't the company or the shares. It was the assumption that I would always choose peace over truth. The real leverage in this marriage wasn't the company or the shares. It was the assumption that I would always choose peace over truth. That night, after our son fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off and let the quiet press in around me. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening custody. He wasn't even lying in ways I could expose easily. He was narrowing my choices until the safest path looked like silence. I went back into the study and unlocked the drawer again, taking out my father's letter with steadier hands than before. This time I wasn't scanning for corporate triggers. I was reading for intention. Near the bottom, in language I had skimmed too quickly before, he wrote, "If alignment deteriorates beyond repair, protection must extend beyond governance. Family stability must be preserved even if leadership changes." Even if leadership changes. I read that line twice. Leadership didn't just mean CEO, it meant authority, control. Further down, there was a brief reference to succession of trusteeship under conflict of interest. I hadn't paid attention to it before because I assumed it was procedural. Now I read it carefully. In the event that the acting trustee's personal interest conflicts materially with beneficiary welfare, temporary oversight transfers to an independent fiduciary. The name listed wasn't corporate counsel. It was my father's longtime private attorney, the one who had handled personal trusts for decades and never appeared at board meetings. It wasn't a hidden trapdoor. It was a pressure valve. I sat back slowly, feeling the shift settle into my chest. If my husband's decisions around the trust could be interpreted as self-serving rather than protective, oversight wouldn't remain in his hands. It would move. Not to me, to someone outside both of us. Footsteps approached in the hallway. He paused at the doorway, studying me in the half-light. "You're still reading that?" he asked. "Yes." He stepped inside this time, closing the door behind him not loudly, but firmly enough that I noticed. "You're looking for reversals that don't exist," he said. "I'm looking for context," I replied. "There are no secret switches," he continued evenly. "Your father and I reviewed every structural element. You reviewed transition," I corrected, "not consequence." His jaw tightened slightly. "If you're planning something, say it." "I'm trying to understand what he anticipated," I answered. "And what do you think that was?" I held up the letter. Conflict of interest. He didn't speak for a beat too long. Then he said, "That clause protects the beneficiary." "From who?" I asked quietly. His hand flexed once at his side before stilling. "From instability," he said. "From decisions driven by resentment. Or from decisions driven by control," I countered. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You wouldn't jeopardize his security." There it was again, not arrogance this time, but conviction. I studied his face. He believed that. He believed my love for our son would anchor me to whatever structure he built around us. "Security isn't the same thing as ownership," I said softly. "And protection isn't the same thing as possession." A flicker passed through his expression, quick, contained. "You're misreading the language," he said. "Am I?" I replied. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd had. He had built layers of insulation, corporate votes, trust clauses, consolidated oversight. But my father hadn't relied on a single safeguard. He had built a mechanism that shifted when pressure built too high. "You think you can trigger that clause?" he asked quietly. "I think you've spent weeks redefining what conflict looks like," I said. He held my gaze, and for the first time I saw calculation adjust, not dramatically, just enough. He wasn't afraid of divorce. He wasn't afraid of scrutiny, but the idea that control could slide out of his hands without warning, that unsettled him. He straightened, composure settling back into place. "There's no conflict," he said. "Not unless you create one." The implication hung in the room. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the desk instead of hiding it away. "Conflict doesn't have to be loud," I said. "Sometimes it's documented." He didn't answer that, and as he turned toward the door, I realized something colder than anger had taken root inside me. The question was no longer whether I would leave. It was whether he would tighten his grip before the system could loosen it for him. The question was no longer whether I would leave. It was whether he would tighten his grip before the system could loosen it for him. I barely slept. He did, or at least he performed sleep convincingly, breathing evenly beside me while my mind replayed every clause I had reread in my father's letter. By Monday afternoon, the board vote passed exactly as he predicted. Proxy margins carried the consolidation comfortably. Oversight of the conditional shares shifted temporarily into his office. No objections loud enough to record. No hesitation significant enough to matter. After the meeting, I remained seated while the room emptied. He gathered his folders methodically. "You knew it would pass," I said. "Yes. And you scheduled it that way." He didn't deny it. "Leadership requires decisiveness," he replied. "Not anger, not defense, just certainty." That evening at home, while he reviewed emails at the kitchen island and our son worked on algebra nearby, my phone buzzed with a notification from compliance. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't labeled investigation. It was a request forwarded from a regulatory body seeking clarification on several share acquisitions made over the past 2 years through Everett Capital Partners. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. 2 years. The same window Daniel had questioned. The same timing tied to the estate guarantee. I walked into the kitchen and placed my phone on the counter in front of him. "Compliance received an external inquiry," I said evenly. He read the subject line without touching the device. "That happens," he replied, "periodically. It references acquisition timing," I said. "That's procedural." His tone was calm, but this time he picked up the phone. A small shift. "They're asking for documentation," I continued. "Of course they are." Our son looked up briefly, sensing something, then returned to his homework. I lowered my voice. "If they widen the review, the estate guarantee surfaces." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "There was nothing improper about it." I didn't say there was. "Then what are you implying?" I held his gaze. "That patterns look different when someone outside the family studies them." Silence fell between us, thick but controlled. He set the phone down carefully. "This is routine," he said again. "Then full transparency won't be an issue." "Transparency always has implications," he replied. "For who?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for his coffee mug, buying time. It was the first time in weeks I had seen him hesitate without disguising it as calculation. "You think this changes something," he said finally. "I think scrutiny doesn't stop at the first document," I replied. He exhaled slowly. "You're letting compliance dictate our marriage now?" "You dictated our marriage when you structured it around containment," I said. The word hung there. Containment. He glanced toward the hallway where our son's backpack lay against the wall. "I structured protection," he said. "You structured leverage," his voice lowered. "Be careful. Not loud, not threatening, but different." I studied him carefully. "Is that advice?" I asked, "or concern?" He didn't answer that either. Instead, he straightened and walked toward the living room, as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. But it hadn't. Because, for the first time, the pressure wasn't coming from me or from a clause in my father's letter. It was coming from outside our house, Regulators don't argue about tone. They examine sequence. They compare dates. They look at what moved before anyone else noticed it moving. And if they started asking why a fund backed by the estate accumulated leverage shortly before succession shifted, they wouldn't be evaluating grief. They would be evaluating intent. Later that night, after our son was asleep, I found him standing alone in the darkened kitchen, staring at nothing. He didn't turn when I entered. "It's procedural," he said again, softer now. I watched his reflection in the window. "Maybe," I replied. And for the first time since the will was read, I understood something that unsettled him more than my opposition ever could. If the outside world began pulling at the thread, it wouldn't just test governance, it would test the story he had been telling about why he deserved control. If the outside world began pulling at the thread, it wouldn't just test governance, it would test the story he had been telling about why he deserved control. The house felt different that week, not louder, but thinner, like the walls were listening. He took calls behind closed doors. I answered compliance emails at the dining table while our son built a science project out of cardboard and glue, asking whether bridges fall if too much weight sits on one side. "Only if the support shifts," I told him, and the words stayed with me long after he went upstairs. On Thursday afternoon, compliance requested expanded documentation on the estate-backed acquisitions tied to Everett Capital. Not an accusation, not yet, just a wider circle. I forwarded the email to my husband without comment. He appeared in the doorway minutes later, phone in hand. "They're asking for internal correspondence," he said. "They're asking for context," I replied. "There's nothing improper in those files." I didn't say there was. He stepped fully into the room this time, closing the door softly behind him. "You think this is momentum," he said. "I think it's visibility," I answered. Silence stretched between us. "If they start mapping timing," I continued, "they'll see how early the fund moved." His jaw tightened. "It moved because transition was inevitable." "It moved before anyone else knew it was," I said. That landed harder than anything else had. He looked away briefly, toward the hallway where our son's laughter echoed faintly from his bedroom. "You're turning process into accusation," he said quietly. "You turned marriage into positioning," I replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the door. He simply stood there, breathing slower than usual, recalculating. The next morning, a formal notice arrived requesting a preliminary interview with executive leadership regarding acquisition strategy and succession timing. Paper had become presence. "I'll handle it," he said immediately. "We'll handle it," I corrected. "There's no need for you to sit in." "I'm not sitting out," I said. Something flickered behind his composure fatigue, maybe, or the first crack of uncertainty. "If this expands," he said carefully, "it could destabilize everything." "Everything?" I asked. "The company, the trust." He didn't say our son's name, but it hung there. I thought about the clause in my father's letter, the one about conflict shifting oversight outward. I didn't explain it again. I didn't need to. If scrutiny widened enough, control wouldn't remain in his hands simply because he believed it should. It would move. Not to me, not to him, to someone outside both of us. That night I found him in the study, sliding documents into his briefcase with deliberate precision. His movements were measured, but his hands weren't perfectly steady anymore. "You're preparing your statement," I said. "Yes. Is it complete?" He paused. "It's factual. That's not what I asked." He closed the briefcase and finally looked at me fully. "What do you want?" he asked, and for the first time, the question sounded less strategic and more tired. I stepped closer. "I want us to stop pretending this is about stability," I said. "It's about control." "Control keeps things from collapsing," he replied. "Sometimes it's what makes them collapse," I said softly. The room went quiet. From down the hall, our son coughed in his sleep and rolled over. We both turned instinctively toward the sound. That reflex shared. Immediate was the only thing that still felt uncomplicated between us. "You wouldn't let them dismantle what I built," he said, not as a command, not as a threat, but as belief. I held his gaze, feeling the weight of the weeks behind us and the uncertainty ahead. He was still convinced I would protect the structure because protecting it meant protecting our child. he was still betting that I would choose preservation over exposure. And as I watched him standing there, briefcase in hand, ready to defend the narrative he had constructed so carefully, I realized something that unsettled me more than any regulatory notice. He wasn't afraid of losing the company. He was afraid of losing control over how the story ended.